Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to wait a moment or so for some more folks to get themselves connected before we dive into the material. But keep in mind that if we do get started and you arrive late, you can always take a look back at the recording. We also have a Goalline YouTube channel where our webinar recordings tend to be uploaded shortly after they're completed. So by the end of the week, we should see this webinar up on our YouTube channel. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. As usual in our webinar series here, you don't have the ability to speak throughout the webinar, but there is a chat. So if there are any questions that you have throughout, I'll be keeping an eye on that. And any questions that don't get answered throughout the webinar, we can look to follow up with you on those things. Today's webinar is on stats and standings. So we're going to take a look at our schedule details that basically have a huge impact on the way that statistics and standings are going to be calculated, and it will affect the way that you proceed with reporting your games, regardless of what sport you happen to be. And we'll take a look at various sports today. So the first thing is, as I said, we'll take a look at schedule details, and we'll take a look at how do you determine whether or not you're going to report just a simple score of the game versus whether you're going to report full individual player statistics for those games. And then the difference between being a club or an association versus being the league organization that would report those individual stats for both teams, as opposed to just your own association or your own club team. We're going to take a look at tiebreaker rules, because of course those have a major impact in not only the order in which standings are calculated, but also the columns that you're actually going to see in the standings columns. And I'll make some kind of general comments and recommendations on what columns should be displayed based on some of the schedule details that you may have. And we'll also take a look at, in general, the point values that are associated. And we'll mention a couple of different areas where there may be some advanced point value features that might be available to your sport. And then, of course, we'll dive into how you actually report those game scores with or without individual statistics. And we'll try to take a look at all of the different sports that we have on Goalline that do offer individual statistics. But whether we offer individual stats or not, you can always report game scores and maintain standings based on game scores for any team sport, as long as it is a simple score entry. So we'll dive in here, and as we're getting used to seeing some of the demo sites here. So this is Trevor. He is our sales representative for Goalline, and he has a great demo site here set up, and it's also multi-sport. So we're going to be taking a look at kind of how do we get these standings calculated here once we start seeing games played, those wins, losses, and ties. And basically this is a good look at what the default values are going to be in your standings for the average organization. So games played, wins, loss, tie, overtime, point, goals for and goals against. And of course, the points is where we're going to actually be determining who's winning in the standings anyway. So this is how basically the standings get calculated, and how ties get recognized, and how ties get broken amongst some of those rules. Whether you have the layout that we're looking at here, like Trevor's demo site, or if you have one that looks more like my demo site here, the Northeast Athletic Officials Association, you're going to log in using the admin login in the upper right hand corner. And depending on your permissions as a user, you're going to be brought either to your master menu, where you can see kind of all of your menu options, including the officials tab, or if you are just a league administrator or just a team administrator, whether it's more than one of those leagues or teams or not, you may be brought directly to one of those, or you may be brought to sort of a blank screen asking you to select from your permitted leagues and teams. At the end of the day, the point is you're going to have to get yourself to the statistics tab. So if I'm reporting game scores, I'm going to be doing that from either the league or the team control panel. So I'm going to select here just to navigate into there, my women's league. And then from here, I'm going to select that I want to go and manage statistics. When I get here, it's going to show me some different options. So I have one tile here that's going to show me any unreported games or just today's unreported games. Then I can look by schedule. So I have a regular season schedule and an exhibition schedule. So depending on which schedule the game exists on that I want to report, I'm going to use the appropriate tile to select the appropriate game. When I go in to report those game scores, you usually are going to see a date range that goes back a few days and goes ahead a few days because generally speaking, reporting games might be happening at the time. You may be doing it live, you may be doing it the same day, but you may be going back in time and reporting games from the weekend sometime throughout the week. Either way, you're going to see this default date range, but you can always search for all games or search for certain games that are unreported, games that maybe belong to the other schedule, games that belong to a certain team, and so on. And you have options here to report the game, reset the game, and you also have the forfeit option available here. So if you do manage forfeits, if that's something that happens in your league or in your association, then you can use this option here, and it's going to use some of the schedule details that we will take a look at later. Before we dive too far into that, let's take a look at the features that are going to have a major impact on our statistics, on our standings. So the first thing we'll do is we'll start at the master menu. Shameless plug here. We do have another webinar coming up, but I'm going to close this here so that it doesn't show up for our session anymore. We have a webinar coming up on Thursday that's going to be talking about all kinds of features and how they integrate with Goalline. So if your association enjoys using Goalline, make sure you share that with your neighboring association so that they can join and find out whether or not Goalline's a good fit for them as well. So now that shameless plug is out of the way, let's go down here into the schedule section, and we're going to go to our manage tiebreakers tool. So with manage tiebreakers, what you can do is create a tiebreaker that applies to you based on your competition rules for essentially whatever rules you have. And when you do have different sports within your Goalline site, you might see some additional layers that might not be available on a single sport. As you can see here, I do have a multi-sport site, so I've got some different sport options here. So when I'm applying a certain schedule to rugby or volleyball, I can make sure that I have a specific tiebreaker that's good for them. You can also just create your own generic tiebreakers and apply them to any schedule that you want. So I'm going to just click on here our big old tiebreaker, and I'm just going to edit that. I can give it whatever title I want. So if you do have different tiebreaking rules for different ages or even different skill levels, you're able to use the tiebreaker label here to make it as appropriate as you need it to be for that age or skill category. And then you have up to 10 layers that you can use to break ties. The Goalline's default is going to be, usually it's pretty well applicable to most organizations. So the Goalline default is going to be based on points, then games played. So the least games played that have the same number of points, the team with the least games played is going to win that tiebreaker. It will also then go to total wins, then total goals for, then total goals against. And at that point, the system may do a coin flip if all of those values maintain the fact that these teams are still tied. It may do a coin flip. If it does use a coin flip, it's using a computer algorithm to determine the winner, and it will place the standings in that order, having broken the tie with all of the available layers plus a coin flip. You can also add that coin flip option, but just keep in mind that this is the system doing a coin flip for you. It is not for you to stand and do an actual coin flip with two teams and then determine the winner that way. So you supply your layers of your tiebreaker, and you do have an option that's listed down below here that if you have a partially broken tie, so an example where there are three teams maybe tied, as soon as one of those teams is no longer tied based on maybe step 1 and step 2, you're able to say that you want it to restart. And so take those 2 remaining tied teams and start back at step 1 and step 2 and step 3 and so on. So you have this option on all of your tiebreaker options here. And then you can apply a different type of tiebreaker if you want it to be different based on 2 teams being tied or any number of teams being tied. And it works exactly the same way. You just set up those layers. So this is how we determine that. I'll just open the drop down here and show a little bit of what those options are, but there's all kinds of layers here that should be applicable to any kind of sport and any kind of competition rule that is going to use things like goals for, goals against, points for, points against, penalties and things like that. There are some tie-breaking layers that you can select regardless of your choices when it comes to individual player statistics, but it is very important to understand that if, for example, you're using least penalty minutes overall, you must be tracking individual player statistics, because if you're not tracking individual player statistics, the system doesn't know how many penalties may have been issued. Same thing goes with things like earliest goal or earliest goal against tied teams and things like that. These do rely on tracking individual player statistics so that the system is aware of how many penalty minutes there were, when goals were scored, and by who, and so on. So keep that in mind, that using tiebreaker layers that require individual statistics, you do need to be tracking those. If you have those layers but you're not tracking them, the system is going to end up just skipping that as a layer because it's not going to have any data to put towards that tie-breaking layer. And then we get to the columns in the standings. And so this is something where even if Goalline's default tiebreaker applies perfectly to your competition rule, you may want to set up your own so that you can influence the columns that are going to show up in your standings pages. And these, again, can be completely different for every schedule or every division that you have. So for every single one of the tiebreakers that you create, you can have a custom set of columns in your standings. And this is particularly useful for organizations that maybe don't want certain columns to display. If you don't want goals for or against to be in your columns for standings, you don't have to include those. When you're not using things like overtime and shootout point values that differ from a regular win, you don't necessarily need to show a shootout win or an overtime win in your standings columns. So for example, oftentimes, especially in hockey, we'll use that as the example here, a win is typically 2 points. And a loss is typically 0 points. However, if I lose in overtime, I might get a point. And if I lose in a shootout, I might get a point. And so if I have an overtime win or an overtime loss, I might want to show those in the standings columns because they are going to be associated with a point. And it may be confusing to the public if I don't show overtime loss or shootout loss, but those teams do get a point. What the system will do is it will accumulate all the losses into the same loss column. So just into this loss column here. When that happens, I may not recognize that your one win for 2 points. How did you manage to get 4 points? And it's because you had one overtime loss and one shootout loss. So it's important when you do associate a point value for losing in overtime or losing in a shootout, it's important to display those columns so that the public is able to discern where did those points come from if they don't add up to the number of points associated with their wins or their ties. So just keep that in mind because every sport is a little bit different. You can see here that you can add a bunch of different options. We can have differentials, we can have streaks and your last 10 displayed and things like that. Win percentage is a big one that baseball organizations often use. There's in some cases, you're going to see a win percentage versus a conference win percentage, which is helpful depending on how you break up your divisions as far as whether or not you use conferences or pools or different groups and things like that. So the columns in your standings, very important to know that this is where you can come to adjust the columns in your standings. And you may find things like you have fair play points set up on your schedule details, but if you don't choose to display the fair play column, then that point value or display setting may not actually be showing up in the column in the standings columns. So make sure that for any schedules that you do have fair play things that you might want to display, that you're displaying that column. Whether or not this impacts the point value for the team is going to depend on the next set of details that we're going to take a look at, which is our schedule details settings. So this covers our tiebreaker. Sometimes I like to just remind everyone quickly that points is not listed as a layer, and that is because points is how we've determined that there's a tie in the first place. And we've definitely done some pretty creative things when it comes to our tiebreakers and our standings columns to accommodate organizations that maybe don't use that point value. Volleyball comes to mind because there's two different ways to score volleyball. Not two different ways, I should say, but there's both point values and set values. And so depending on how your league manages things, we can certainly help out with making sure that those standings display the way that you want them to and calculate that way. So I'm going to exit out of here, and we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to hop right back into my women's league here, and we'll take a look at the schedule details that apply when it comes to setting up your schedule so that your standings will calculate properly. So we'll go down to the schedule section. I've got a couple of schedules set up here as we saw in the statistics side. And if I want to make changes or take a look at my schedule details, I'm going to click to edit schedule details for the schedule that I want to adjust. And it's pretty common to, have different durations and different schedule details for an exhibition schedule compared to a regular season. So there may be various times where you're going to have some slightly different details. So I'm going to click edit schedule details here, and we'll take a look just top to bottom, what has the most impact on your standings and your statistics entries here. So the first thing is whether or not it's active when people click on standings. So if this is your main schedule, then this should be set to yes. Lots of organizations have more than one schedule within a season, things like preseason, regular season, tiering rounds, or relegation schedules, playoff schedules, and things like that. So whatever schedule should be the active schedule is the one that should say yes. All of your other schedules can be active and published, but they're not the ones that we see by default when we click the standings column or standings item in the menu. Whether or not you want it published and to publish the standings are independent settings, but obviously we do want those to be set to yes, assuming you want the schedule to be visible and you want the standings page to have data on it. Otherwise, if I said no to whether or not I want to publish the standings, the schedule will still be published. I can still report games as usual, but the standings page would not display at all. So just keep that in mind as well. Then we get to whether or not you're tracking individual player statistics. And with tracking, are you also displaying them? It is possible to track individual statistics without actually having those individual stats displayed on the public side of the website. Often these go hand in hand, where if I say yes to this, I will usually want to say yes to this, but it is perfectly fine to keep the display set to no. So I can report it, but set this to no. I certainly don't recommend the other way around. I would not recommend displaying stats if you're not planning on tracking them, because then those stats pages just would never have any data in them, because all of the goals, for example, would all just be associated with the team and not associated with any given individual player. There are options for distinguishing rookie statistics and goalie statistics and how you want those to display. So if you want the goalie stats to be separate from the player stats, you can set that up here. So by default, if I say no, goalie stats don't display with the player stats. They display in their own separate little column or little section on those player stats pages. But if I just want them to be in line with the other players, I can just say, yes, I want them to be in line up there. If you're using conferences and pools, you can determine whether or not the standings should reflect games that are played across the conferences versus only counting games that are played within games in the same conference, which is what I have set up here. If I take a look at my my Women's Hurricane Inlet League, I'm going to just hop over into there and take a look at the standings and outline a little bit of what that means. So, for example, the Cadbury Cadets is up in my Pool A, and they may have played one of their games against the Rain team that is in Pool B. And if that's the case, that game doesn't count when it comes to the standings that are displayed here. Those statistics would count for the individual players if I'm tracking goals and penalties and that type of thing, but they're not going to count when it comes to the point values associated with wins, losses, or ties for the Cadbury Cadets in this schedule, in this conference. I can have an overall set of standings that I can place below if I want those kind of standings to be recognized, or if I want all of the games played to be recognized in there. They certainly would still have games played, but their wins would only be counting and their points would only be counting if those teams are in the same conference. So this is a setting where if your within conference matters and you shouldn't count any games that are played between teams that are not in the same conference, you want to set this to yes. If you're not using conferences, this doesn't have any consequences. And here's where I select that tiebreaker that I want to use based on what I'm wanting for this particular schedule in this division. And again, this can be different for every schedule. It does not have to be the same for a whole league or for a whole association. So I can select whatever tiebreaker I want to apply here. And when I select it and save my schedule details, it will refresh my public side and update those columns accordingly. The next section regarding points awarded is obviously going to have a major impact on the way standings are calculated. Typically what we see, especially, and again, this does apply mainly to hockey, but it also applies pretty universally to a ton of different sports, such as, rugby and soccer and things, and basketball often have very, very similar point value structures. When you're looking at the points awarded section, I do have overtime values, shootout values, and forfeit values. I also have an advanced feature enabled on my demo site that I can apply a a period specific point value. So you can receive, it's essentially bonus points for having won the period in addition to the points that would be applied by winning the game. So if 2 points are awarded for a win, but 1 point is awarded for per period wins, and I won the first period and the third period, I might get 4 points for winning that game. The other team will receive 1 point for having won the second period. And that's based on, again, having scored individual player statistics, inserting the time of goals so that the system understands when goals were scored throughout the game in order to be able to calculate a per period win, loss, or tie value. When it comes to the wins, losses, and ties, it is important to include a value for every section that applies to you. Shootout and overtime win values should be applicable here, but if you do not award a point and you don't have any shootout values applicable here, they don't actually end up being recorded as shootout values later on. So you'll never be asked when reporting, did this game end in a shootout? You do have to set a point value here in order for the system to recognize that you want a shootout value to be reported. Otherwise, it's just going to assume that after the regulation and potential overtime periods have been completed, that's the end of the reporting and that there's no additional point value for having lost in a shootout. So if you do go to regulation and you don't allow ties, so then you go to overtime and you don't allow a tie after overtime periods have been played, then you go to a shootout. It's very important to include a value in the regulation, overtime, and shootout win value spaces. So in this case here, I've got my 2 points. We'll have 2 points and 2 points. So no matter how I won the game, I get 2 points for winning. Losing in regulation is typically 0, but depending on the organization and the sport, losing in overtime may give you a point. If losing in overtime gives you a point, typically losing in a shootout also gives you a point. Ties often apply 1 point. And then, of course, you could have an overtime tie. But if your organization and your competition drives you directly to a shootout after the overtime periods have been played, you should not apply a point value for an overtime tie. You could, if there was ever going to be a scenario in which that applied. But in general, if you're doing shootouts, chances are you're not allowing an overtime tie. If you do, though, make sure that you have the appropriate point value in the overtime tie value section. The next thing that we can see down here is our forfeit values. So there are forfeit win values and forfeit loss values. Often what we see is a forfeit win value is generally more points than a regulation win. And that's typically more as a punishment in the standings than it is as a reward for the team that didn't forfeit. But if you do such a thing, you might want to say that there's 3 points maybe for a forfeit win value. Or maybe they receive 1 point, but they receive a score and basically their goals for gets bolstered. So when you look at a forfeit win or a forfeit loss is almost always 0. I can't imagine receiving a point for a forfeit. But the forfeit win, if you do apply a score, meaning, and again, using the example that I've seen in soccer many, many times, is that the point value is 3 points and you win by 3-0. So you can insert something like that as well to make it so that a forfeit actually awards the other team 3 goals. If that applies to you, then use these fields appropriately, but you can also disable the use of forfeits at all. And that really just depends on how your league runs and how those competitions tend to go. As an association, you're not really going to be concerned much with the point values here, but the settings on this page are still going to be applicable. They're still going to be asked here, but if you're not the one maintaining the standings, then you don't have to worry too much about that. The next thing that may or may not be affecting your standings and your point values as far as who's winning and who's in first place and who's receiving fair play points is the fair play bonus section. So there can be a fair play bonus point. By default, this is going to be set as off, but there are 2 different options for how you can apply this. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to use either of these options, whether your option is selected as standings or display, you do want to make sure that your tiebreaker includes the fair play column so that people will be able to actually see it on the public side of the site when they look at your standings. If I select standings, that means that the point value that we award during a fair play report is going to actually add a point to that team in the standings, affecting their standings. And again, going back to looking at 2 points for a win, if my team won the game, we get 2 points. If we are also awarded the fair play bonus point and the setting says standings, I'm now going to have 3 points for that win because I get my 2 for winning and I get my bonus point for fair play. This fair play dropdown can be either 1 point or 0.5 or a scale 0 to 10. The scale for 0 to 10 only works in a scenario where you're using this as a display. So that is, they're both options that are available in there, but 0 to 10, this is a fair play ranking for each team on the game reporting screen. And it can show in standings if you have it set to display, but it does not impact the actual standings if this is the option you're using. If you use the 1 or the 0.5, then it does add to the points in the standings that affect the standings, including any breaking of ties, if that's the setting that you've displayed or selected. If you only have it set to display, using any of these 3 options will not affect the team's ranking in the standings, but it will display their fair play point values in the standings if you have that set to display. If it's something that you only use on the admin side, you don't necessarily have to worry about that all the way through to fair play being shown in your standings. If it's just something that you like to see on the admin side when games are being reported, but it is something to know that you can set it to display to be a display value or a standings value, and you have your options for how it would actually work. This is actually an independent thing from the fair play / mercy rule that's shown here. The fair play and mercy rule impact standings in a smaller way than fair play, because what happens with the fair play mercy rule, for example, if I set it to be 7, what this means is the scoring differential that the standings will use to calculate for tie-breaking purposes is never going to take into account a differential of more than 7 goals in a given game. So if I win 10-0, but the differential here is set as 7, my team, for the purpose of the tiebreaker and for point values, is only going to be given credit for 7 of those goals. It does not mean that all 10 of those goals don't count for the individual players who scored them. The individual statistics would still count. I can still report the game as being 10-0 and report all 10 of those goals and give them, distribute them and the associated assists and things to different players. But only 7 of the goals would actually count towards the tiebreaker when we use things like goals for, goals against. Keep in mind that when I say the differential, if I won 10-0, there's basically 3 goals that I don't really get to have credit for. But if I only won 10-3, then I'm going to get all 10 of my goals, because it's not sort of a maximum number of goals. It's a maximum difference. So if I do win by 7 points, I get all 7 of those, or all of the points. If I win by more than 7, that's when it starts to implement the mercy rule and the fair play differential here. So just to keep that in mind. And then one more setting here that does impact the point values is whether or not you award a point for a shutout. So a shutout would be anything to 0. If you say yes, they would get 1 point in addition to the points for their win in the standings, and that would have an impact on things like tiebreakers and the order in which your standings are calculated. So just to recap, if you do overtime and shootouts, make sure that your win values, loss values, and tie values are applied to all 3 of those sections. If you do have forfeit wins with a score, make sure that you complete those. And then you do go through that reporting of a forfeit the same way as we saw earlier. And I'll remind us where that's located in a little bit there. And then if you do happen to do points per period, wins or losses, you can set this up. If you don't see this, but that does sound like something you want to use, you can absolutely let us know, and our support team can turn that feature on for you. When I get down to the game duration, there's not a lot here that makes a huge difference, but there is one that will impact the number or the way that you're going to report individual stats for a game that may or may not go to overtime. So I'm saying here that for my hockey league, there are 3 periods, and each period is 20 minutes long. And I have here that the overtime period is 5 minutes, but I have not indicated how many overtime periods there might be. This is what's really important to make sure that we can properly indicate that you do want overtime, because you're setting up that there are points based on overtime wins, losses, or ties, or shootout values. So if I go and we only have 1 5-minute overtime period, then I want to indicate that we go to 1 overtime period and then we immediately go to a shootout. If you go to 3 overtime periods, then indicate that there's 3 overtime periods, and so on. So just make sure that this is set accurately, and we'll see how this is going to impact our settings when we go to report games. I'm actually going to save this change here. I'm going to turn that off and just change a couple things back to what I was doing earlier. So I'm going to set it so that we do have 1 overtime period, and then that's going to be 5 minutes. And then we'll see when we go to report the game, we're going to see where we would recognize that something is happening in overtime in a couple of different areas. Some other things that are important to just keep in mind whenever you're doing a schedule or related thing is the effective start and end date of your schedule. This is it's set in the security options section. Very important to make sure that these dates fall within the season date range. And typically with a regular season schedule, I generally recommend just make it the same as your season date range. But know that if you do have a playoff schedule that follows immediately, you may want to reduce this to make sure that your regular season games cannot be scheduled beyond a certain date. So if playoffs start in April, maybe instead of letting this one go all the way to July, maybe I should finish it up on March 31st, just so I don't accidentally schedule games on my regular season schedule outside of that date range. If I do have other games to play, maybe they're exhibition games, and I would put those on my exhibition schedule and not this schedule. So just keep that in mind as well. When it comes to those conferences, if I do need conferences, I would edit those conferences here. As you can see, I've got a pool A and a pool B. And then here's how I can get those separated standings. So instead of calling that play downs, let's call that overall, and just go ahead and set up a few folks to be in there, or we'll pretend it's overall. I'll just click and show those ones. So I'm going to click to save these changes here now. And then once I do have that change saved, I can show you what that overall standings is going to look like in addition to the standings that we were looking at here. So if I just refresh my screen, because I was already on that page, I've still got my pool A up here. I've still got my pool B, but now I have my overall down here. So any of those cross-conference games that don't count in the standings up here, they can now be shown down here. Because in this league, I'm also tracking individual player stats, you'll notice that I can actually click on the names of teams and it brings me to the player statistics for that team. And I'm able to kind of look around at the different team related options that are for this team. So if I want to look at game results and things like that, I can look at those game results and see the details. I can see here that we were given 2 points for winning this game because the Lightning won, looks like 1-0. And it's going to show me here the team's results for that particular game. So there was 1 goal and there was an assist, and our goalie statistics here's our 60 minutes for our goalie that was in the net. And then I can further drill down and actually view individual player statistics in the same way. So as long as I am tracking these statistics, the public's always able to go in and drill down and kind of take a look at that player's statistics. As players have been with your organization for a long time, these player stats can start to get really detailed, and they are team and schedule specific, which is really great because you can go back and kind of look at your own statistics historically. So that's how that looks there. And now that we're done editing this, let's hop back over to statistics. So we've looked at our tiebreaker rules, which are going to impact the standings columns and the way ties are going to be broken. And then we looked at all of the different schedule details that impact standings and impact whether or not I'm tracking individual player statistics. I haven't taken a look yet or for a while at my exhibition schedule. I don't know if I have any games. I don't have any games on that one. I was just going to see if I had one really quick that wasn't tracking individual stats. But when I click on my regular season schedule, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to see this default date range. And I do have the option here to select a forfeit. And when I do want to select a forfeit, it's going to ask me who wins, who's getting the forfeit in here, and how is it going to work? Did both teams end up forfeiting? Do both teams lose? Or, the Lindor Lions, they won because it was actually ladies' night that forfeited. I can make that a setting. And when I do submit that, I am able to remove that forfeit later. So say there was a misunderstanding and I want to go ahead and no longer, charge them with a forfeit. I can remove the forfeit so that it's not going to show up that way anymore. And that way it's going to affect, I can report the game kind of however I wanted to. I'm just going to refresh myself here because I clicked back a lot instead of doing that. So here I do still have to report the game in order to get those player statistics and the proper score if the game ever did happen. If the game wasn't forfeited and we're going to actually just move it, I might just go to the schedule itself and change the game so that we can move it into a future date. I'm going to click to search all the games on the schedule here. And so here we see there's a bunch of games, lots and lots and lots of games that haven't been reported yet. So let's go and take a look. I'm going to look at this one here and report it. It's already been reported, but I want to take you through the screens. So depending on which sport you are, there are some sports where you're going to see it like this. We're going to see a stepped structure, and other sports, it's going to be more of a one screen, even if you are doing the individual stats. So we'll take a look at those in a couple of moments here. But what happens here is we can see the rosters for the teams, and I can check off any players that aren't present. And I can also typically, I mean, this, I would have to reset this game because it's already been reported, but I can also add players if I need to. So I can add an affiliate player, somebody who was called up at the last minute to help play. This roster is a little bit thin, so maybe they had to use a call up. So that's something that you can always do, is add players here. It is recommended that those players be added to the roster so that they already are here and show up on the printable game sheet before the game. But we know that, of course, it's not always possible to know that you may have call-ups coming to a game. This is also where, if the jersey numbers have been entered on the roster, they would already be populated here. My teams don't have a whole lot of jersey numbers in there already, but what I may need to do is go through and actually apply the jersey numbers that I see based on the game sheet that I have in my hand that I'm comparing things to, like what the game sheet that was used when the game was finished up and the referee finished with it. So once I have my starting lineups here, I can check off if there are coaches, I can check off that they were present and whatnot as well. And then I would click to submit those lineups. And then the next thing I do is I want to report those goals and penalties. So this is the screen that you're going to see for, I'm trying to remember exactly how many sports it is that use this exact one. And so I know for sure hockey, ringette, lacrosse, and soccer all look this way. When you're reporting, other sports like football, basketball, and rugby and baseball do look a little bit different. There are the single screen ones, and I'll show you that in a couple of moments here. But this process, I'm using a hockey example, but for when you're not, if you're soccer, instead of seeing the record a penalty, you're going to be seeing the cards, and you're going to be seeing yellow and red card options and the appropriate reasons why they may have received a yellow or a red card. So it does work. The process is exactly the same, whether or not I am, any of the sports that I just listed off there. So it's just a matter of, are you using penalty references that are specific to hockey, or are you using references that are specific to ringette or lacrosse? And then if you're in soccer, you would see the card references in there for fouls and things and misconduct. The method of reporting, again, is going to be different based on whether you're doing it at the time, whether or not, like if the game is live, or if you're doing it later on. If you're doing it later on, typically what you'll do is be looking at your game sheet and you'll click enter all goals. If I want to enter all the goals, I can say that there were, say, 3 goals scored in the whole game. And then I would indicate what period they happened in, what minute, what second, what team, and then the number of the person who scored and any assists we might want to be giving. And then whether or not it was a special kind of goal, like a game-winning goal or a tying goal or even strength or power play, you can enter that information in here as well. There is a setting on soccer game sheets that doesn't require you to enter the second of a goal being scored. So that may apply to you if you don't track the second, if you only know the minute that things were scored. But if it does ask you for the seconds and you're not sure, you can always just put 0 and it will indicate what minute that happened in. And then you would just submit the goal. So if I am doing this after the fact, it is much easier, a little bit more succinct to go through and enter those goals using the enter all goals. But if I am doing it live, or I want to just be very specific and one at a time do it, I can do that as well. So what I do is select who scored. So I'm going to pick the name of someone who scored by checking their radio button. If they had an assist, I'm going to find out who did the assist, and I'm going to select that. I'm going to indicate when is this happening. So if it's the first period, I select it's the first period, and whatever time is on the clock, let's say there's 2 minutes and 26 seconds on the clock. So player 1 is going to be assisted by best ref, and they're going to score an even strength normal goal. So I can click to enter that goal. That updates the score right away. And when we scroll down, we can see that that goal was scored in the first period, 2 minutes and 26. And it was scored by, well, they both have number 0. So that's not super helpful. But your rosters will have all their jersey numbers. My demo site certainly doesn't. But we can see that works, how that works exactly. So if there was no assists, it doesn't have to necessarily report an assist. Notice how we don't have any second assists in this particular one. So that's the way that works. And the same thing goes for infractions and penalties. I can either click enter all penalties. How many do I have to enter? And so if this is soccer, say there were 4 cards in the game, I would enter that there were 4 cards and hit and continue and do the same thing. And then it's going to ask me the same thing. So I do still always have to decide or tell the system what it was for. So the infraction and the type. For hockey penalties, we've got all the different variations on what kind of penalty it may have been. And so when, who, what, and how long. So once you've entered all those penalties, they would accumulate on the game report as well for everybody to take a look at. So if I did want to do a penalty again, one at a time, I can go over here and Amanda Vellutini, there's triplets on this. So Amanda Vellutini gets, let's do 5 for fighting. Why not? So I can do any of the variations over here. And again, I do want to indicate when this happened. So let's say it happened in the last couple of minutes of the 3rd period, which may result in further suspensions and whatnot for Amanda Vellutini, but that's okay. She's feisty. And so we'll enter that penalty. And so that starts to accumulate our penalty summary over here. And so all those penalties, whether I did enter all or I enter them one at a time, they're all going to accumulate with the appropriate time and type of penalty and who received those penalty infractions. The next thing we can do is report the goaltender statistics. So based on how many goalies you have, you may have your starting goalie already set. And then maybe during the game, they switch, whether they switch mid-period or alternate each period. If I do need to change my goaltender, I can come down here and indicate that the goaltender was changed at a certain time. I think over here, I've got another one to choose from. Yeah. So we've got Block U is in the net now. But what if in the 2nd period, 20 minutes to go, so basically the top of the 2nd, we have Tim comes in and he's going to be the goalie. So I can enter a new goaltender. And as it works, what happens is that it will automatically calculate who received things like the goals and the shots. So originally, Block U was actually showing as having that goal. Oh, no, sorry. That was the other way around. I had that goal on the other side there. He had 2 goals against over here. I should have done it the other way around. But it will recognize based on their time in and time out and whoever else came into the game. It's going to recognize who took shots. It's going to recognize who actually had the goal scored against them based on the time. So if you ever found yourself in a position where a goalie has a goal against them that wasn't really against them, maybe you want to take a look and you can reset goaltender statistics to make sure that you can enter the appropriate goalies at the appropriate time to make sure that they are getting the credit for not just the minutes played, but the goals that should have been against the other goalie, for example, would be credited against them. So this goaltender stats tab is going to combine with the goals that were entered on step 2. So that it knows when were goals scored, and then you're telling the system when were the goalies put into the game, when were they switched, did you have an empty net for any given amount of time, and if you are tracking shots, you can indicate shots over here. So shots does let you indicate how many shots were against this goalie, and that will help drive additional player statistics that can be seen on the public side of the site by automatically having the system calculate your goalie's save percentage. And that goalie save percentage is going to be based on their minutes played, their goals against, and the shots they took in any given game. So if you want that really great layer and level of statistics, having all of these things entered is definitely going to help you out. This can be done for soccer as well. There tends to not really be an empty net in soccer. That's against the rules, actually. So you can't have an empty net in soccer, but the same goaltender stats being able to indicate the shots and things does apply as well. So once you have your goaltender stats all set, you're going to get to that final step. So this is the second place where we saw the overtime indicator. I'll click back on step 2 just to take a look at it again, because I did indicate that we do have overtime periods, and it's going to ask me which overtime was it. So I only said that we do 1, so it's only giving me a 1 as an option here. But if I said 2 or 3, it would say which overtime period, 1, 2, or 3 did this happen in. So when a goal is scored in overtime, I would be able to indicate that it happened in the first overtime period, with, say, like 3 minutes on the clock. And chances are that's the end of the game, because in hockey that would be typically golden goal. So or sudden death, or whatever we want to call that nowadays. So that's where we see the first indicator of our overtime options. And then when I get into the end game step here, we're going to see when did the game end. And this is how the system knows, did it go to overtime? So even without goals and penalties being recorded, this is where I'm going to say what was the clock when the game was actually over. So if it was over in the third period with 0 on the clock, that means it didn't go to overtime. There was no overtime winner or loser. There was only a regulation winner. There would have been no shootout winner. But because I do have shootout points set up, it's going to ask me whether or not there was a shootout winner. If it did end in overtime, I would say that it ended in, again, first, second, or third overtime, and so on, with however much time on the clock. And it does make sense not to have this be 0 if you have a sudden death overtime period, because the game would have ended with 1 minute or 2 minutes and 59 seconds on the clock, if it was sudden death. If it was 0, because we went to a shootout, I'm going to indicate that it ended in overtime and Blizzard won the shootout. So I would indicate that, depending on these are all based on settings that we had indicated. So I've told the system that we do overtime and how many periods, and I've told them that we do have a point value for a shootout. So we don't allow the ending in a tie. So I do need to indicate that there was a shootout winner. When you have the appropriate permission, you may also want to check the box that says lock this game to prevent further changes. But that depends on your structure and your procedure as an association or as a league. Oftentimes, the person who is holding on to the game sheets and physically entering or verifying the game reports are going to lock to prevent further changes, because coaches and managers may have been granted access to do that initial game report. And so they don't lock the game. And once you have locked the game, those coaches and managers who have individual access at the team level to report games would not have the ability to make any further changes once it has been locked. If there are further changes that need to be made, or corrections, that can always be done, but it does have to be done by one of the administrators within your organization that has permission to lock and unlock game scores. Then I would hit game over. Once I hit game over, it really is over. It's all done. The game is over, and the game report will be complete on the public side. Even if the game isn't complete yet and I haven't hit game over, if I have started to report the game, there will be some details that will start to accumulate on the public side of the site. And that is to accommodate the fact that Goalline does support live scoring of games. So if the arena or facility that you're in has internet access, you can have live game reporting happening in the venue, and that would update automatically as things are reported within the Goalline reporting tools, as you see here. There is no difference as far as the method that you use to report a game live versus later. It's just a matter of what your preferences are going to be. So that was a deep dive into the individual game reporting for hockey, but that also applies to our structure for ringette and lacrosse and soccer. Now I'm going to dive in and show you a couple of other options when it comes to how you might be reporting games. And so there may not be individual player statistics for you at all. I'm just going to go and check and see here on one of my schedules. actually, why don't I just go right back to where I was, and I can show you how easy it is to make that change. So if you do decide that you're not going to do individual stats, you don't have to do those individual stats if you don't want to. So you can come and turn them off. So I'm just going to turn them off really quick here and show you the difference on the game reporting screen when we say, no, we're not tracking individual player statistics. And note that if you do make that change, it won't have any impact on the previously reported games. It doesn't change any of that. It does still, everybody still gets credit for their goals and things, but it would just change the fact that going forward, you're only going to be reporting the game score. So heading right back into reporting game scores here, I can click to report any of these games, and it's not that stepped process that we just saw. It's just asking me what was the score. Because we have some point values associated with overtime and shootouts, I am still able to indicate that we do have an overtime win or loss or a shootout win or loss. And I do still have the ability to lock that game. But all I need to do here is enter what was the final score of that game. So we can say that, sure, it ended in overtime, and I can submit that game report. And it's really as simple as that. There's nothing else required. That game is now reported. The standings are going to reflect it, but things like tiebreaker layers that require penalty minutes or individual game or goal timing wouldn't apply if there was a tie that needed to be broken, and I'm no longer tracking those statistics. So that's the simple game reporting. And honestly, if you are any other sport that Goalline does not have full individual player statistics for, this is the method of reporting that game. So you're going to be able to enter the final game score for any team sport that you may have to report on. I'm going to hop into, actually, I'm going to go over to Trevor's demo site as I think he has some, let's see here. Pretty sure he has some Little League. Yeah. So let's go take a look at a baseball example over here. So the scheduling side of things, everything about the schedule details is essentially the same. The difference is instead of number of periods, it's going to ask you the number of innings so that it knows how to ask you to report those games. So the method is exactly the same. You navigate to statistics and you find the schedule that you're looking for, and then you go to report on that game. So this is an example of reporting baseball scores for a league. So the first thing we see is we've indicated that we have 7 regular innings, 3 additional extra innings, and then we have some summary data that can be included up here. You can see that there are offensive and pitching statistics, and we see the top row here is our Blue Jays roster, and then as I scroll down, then we get to the Cardinals roster. So this is similar in that we're reporting all of the appropriate statistics, but it's all on one screen. It's not a stepped process. And again, based on sitting with the game sheet, the game report in your hands, you would complete this as you see fit here. A lot of organizations are going to want to use some, but maybe not all of the columns that we see here. So the first thing that is important to do is to indicate the players who are in the game. And so when you think about the stepped process that we looked at, we don't have to skip those steps. We do just have to indicate who was present at the game. And the players that are checked off are the only players that you can add statistics here for. The pitching stats does tend to be one of the most important statistics that baseball and softball organizations do want to track, in particular for their youth, and that would be the pitch count column. So if nothing else, and you only track your scores per inning and your pitch count, you do just have to indicate who was present at the game, whatever statistics you want to track, whether or not there were decisions made and things like that, and then whether or not you have that pitch count. And this is publicly available on those player stats and the game summaries so that folks can take a look and kind of monitor the pitching stats for individual players. So you can enter these statistics and you can save and click enter as you go numerous times when it comes to reporting baseball scores. So again, this can be done kind of in a live environment. It's just not as it's not the same format of the screen as we saw the other way. And again, this could just go to a simple score entry by editing the schedule details and saying that, no, we're not actually going to track individual player statistics. We're just going to ask for the score of the game, in which case you're only asked for the final score of the game. Other sports that are similar are going to be football. So we'll take a quick peek down here. I've got football set up in here somewhere. So when it comes to football, again, we're going to see statistics that you can enter for a variety of stats options here. Let's see here. I might not have any in my current season. I may have. Let's see if I have any exhibitions. We'll super quick here. Let's just go ahead and create a game. So I'm going to create a game. Team 1. Team 1 is going to play Team 2. There we go. So now we'll have a game to report. And that was regular season. So here's my game that I just created, and I want to go ahead and report that game. So similar to the baseball example that we just looked at, and this is actually very, very similar to the basketball example that we'll look at in just a second here, where I put in based on what our system is told. So there are 4 quarters and potential for overtime, and then we have a final. And then we have all kinds of different statistic options that we can select here. Again, I want to indicate whether or not the players were present. And because I'm doing this from a league, I'm doing this for both teams. The only difference when game reporting for individual club teams is that you're only going to be responsible for your statistics, and you're just going to be asked what the score was for the other team. You are not expected to have the roster of your visiting teams or teams you've traveled to go play against. You're not expected to have those rosters in your Goalline system. You only need to report those individual stats for your team. If your league happens to be tracking those individual stats and you're tied in through scheduling tie-ins, then those statistics would push down to whatever you opt to display on your public website anyway, but that reporting would be done for both teams at the league level. So lots of different ways to get that taken care of here. So this structure here is how we'll see our sports that are not using that stepped process that have our live game reporting options for rugby and not rugby, sorry. Rugby looks just like this. For ringette, lacrosse, hockey, and soccer. So those are our game report options. I think I'm just going to double check on my notes here as I wrap up and make sure. So yeah, for individual player statistics, rugby, football, basketball, softball, baseball, soccer, hockey, and lacrosse are all individual statistics that you can be tracking at the very least. And depending on your, each individual schedule and each individual division may have different settings when it comes to tracking and displaying full stats and how you want to go ahead and report those games. But there are lots of things that you can do, and you can report sort of minimum amounts for everything. The one last thing that I will show you, just because I happen to have it enabled on my site here, and this is really great for tournaments. It's really great for organizations that have really quick turnaround, and that is to report multiple game scores. This ignores your settings for individual player stats entirely and says, what was the score? So even if I do want to report individual statistics, I can do that later. And what I would do is come in here and just report the final score. I'm just going to say that the final score was 10-3. For this game and report that score. And I can do this for multiple games at a time. I just didn't have a whole lot of games scheduled for that particular date range. But when I do that, I can go back in and report the way that I just walked you through and add the individual player stats. So the benefit there is I can get a quick score entry so the standings can update themselves as quickly as possible. And let's say we have a turnaround in a condition where the playoffs are going to be based on the standings and we need that playoff to push through. It's really important to get those scores in quickly. So that is an option that should be available. If you don't see the report scores option from your master menu and you think that that's a useful feature, you can reach out to support and we can definitely enable that for you really, really quickly to get that as an option. But keep in mind, it is just simple score entry. And if you do want to report those individual stats, you just go and basically re-report the same games that already have a score entered down the road. So that covers today's webinar on our stats and standings. So we took a look at tiebreakers, schedule settings that affect your point values for wins, losses, and ties, whether or not you're going to be doing individual stats, and then a nice deep dive into how to actually report game scores for various sports. If you have any follow-up questions, you know how to reach us. We've got lots of support options and lots of avenues to take a look at some of the self-help material that we have available. And I look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great day.